In 1969, NASCAR had a problem. The cars were getting too fast. Not because of bigger engines or better drivers, but because a small team of engineers at Chrysler had figured out something that would change racing forever. They discovered that the air itself could be a weapon. And the cars they built, the Dodge Daytona and Plymouth Superbird, were so dominant, so utterly untouchable, that NASCAR eventually had to ban them just to keep the sport competitive. Now look, I've gone deep on a lot of racing stories, and I keep coming back to this one because it hits different. This isn't just a story about fast cars. This is a story about engineers who refuse to color inside the lines, about a corporation willing to look completely ridiculous if the data said it would work, and about a 2-foot-tall wing mounted on a street-legal vehicle that regular Americans could buy at their local dealership. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about what happens when aerospace-level engineering crashes headfirst into American stock car racing. If you're someone who geeks out over motorsport history, engineering breakthroughs, and the golden age of muscle cars, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, before we get into the Daytona and the Superbird, we need to understand what NASCAR actually looked like before these cars showed up. Because without that context, you won't fully appreciate just how insane everything that followed actually was. By the mid-1960s, stock car racing had transformed into something that resembled an industrial war more than a sport. Ford versus Chrysler versus General Motors. The big three automakers were pouring tens of millions of dollars into their racing programs because of a philosophy that had become gospel in Detroit. Wins on Sunday meant sales on Monday. That was it. That was the whole equation. You wanted everyday Americans sitting in their living rooms on a Sunday afternoon, watching your car dominate on television, and then walking into a dealership on Monday morning wanting exactly that. It was advertising at 200 miles per hour, and it worked. But here's the thing. Everyone was attacking the same problem from the same direction. More cubic inches, bigger carburetors, better cylinder heads, higher compression ratios. If you wanted your car to go faster, you made the engine produce more power. That was the universal answer, and for years, it delivered results. Lap speeds climbed steadily through the early and mid-60s, and the crowds absolutely loved it. The races got more exciting, the speeds got more terrifying, and the manufacturers kept pouring money in. Here's what nobody was really thinking about seriously, at least not in NASCAR. At 150 miles per hour, horsepower is not your only enemy. Air is. The faster a car moves, the more violently the air resists it. It doesn't just push back against the front of the car. It creates turbulent zones that rob the chassis of stability. It flows over the roof and generates lift at the rear, which pulls the back tires off the surface. At 160 miles per hour, your engine might be producing 500 horsepower, but a huge percentage of that is disappearing into the effort of simply punching through atmosphere. The most powerful engine in the world still has to deal with the laws of physics, and nobody had cracked that code yet in stock car racing. Nobody, that is, except the engineers at Chrysler who were about to change everything. Now, to understand why Chrysler felt the urgency they did, you need to know where they stood heading into 1968. They were losing. Not catastrophically, not embarrassingly, but consistently enough that the people running the racing program were feeling the pressure. Ford had found a way to extract more power from their engines, and with their Torino platform, they had a car that was decently shaped for high-speed work. General Motors wasn't far behind. Chrysler had the horsepower, but they kept finishing second, third, occasionally fourth, on tracks where top speed mattered most. Something had to change, and a man named John Pointer was about to figure out exactly what that something was. Pointer worked in Chrysler's Special Vehicles Group, a small but deeply talented team responsible for making sure Chrysler's racing efforts stayed competitive. And Pointer had access to something that almost nobody else in NASCAR had seriously used before: a wind tunnel. Chrysler had relationships with defense contractors, companies that built military aircraft and guided missiles, and those contractors had sophisticated aerodynamic testing facilities. Pointer convinced the right people to let him use those facilities to test scale models of their race cars. What he found when he started running those tests was simultaneously obvious in retrospect and genuinely shocking in the moment. The 1968 Dodge Charger, the car that was supposed to be their racing flagship, the car that looked absolutely gorgeous in a showroom, was an aerodynamic catastrophe. That iconic recessed grille that everyone loved? It created a pocket of dead, turbulent air at the front of the car that generated tremendous drag. The tunneled rear window, that dramatic styling detail that made the Charger look so dramatic from behind? It caused massive lift at the rear end, meaning the faster the car went, the more the back tires wanted to leave the ground. Pointer later described the Charger's aerodynamic properties with a phrase that became famous in racing circles: beautifully terrible. And he meant that genuinely. It was a beautiful car that was terrible at going fast. So Pointer and his team went to work. Their first solution was what they called the Charger 500. The name referred to NASCAR's minimum production requirement. If you wanted to race a special version of your car, you had to build at least 500 examples for the street. The Charger 500 addressed the two biggest problems. They replaced the recessed grille with a flush-mounted unit, eliminating that dead air pocket at the front. And they swapped the tunneled rear window for a flat piece of glass that didn't generate lift. These sound like small changes, and honestly, looking at photos of the two cars side by side, they are subtle. But in the wind tunnel, they made a measurable difference in drag coefficient. Chrysler was genuinely excited. This felt like their answer, their edge, their weapon for 1969. And then Ford unveiled the Torino Talladega. The Talladega was Ford's own aerodynamic special, built specifically because their engineers had been thinking along similar lines. It had a longer, more pointed nose than the standard Torino, a flush-mounted grille, and carefully reshaped rear fenders to reduce turbulence. Ford had done their homework, and when the 1969 season opened, the results were uncomfortable for Chrysler. The Talladega was faster than the Charger 500 on the big superspeedways. Their improvement hadn't been enough. They'd closed the gap, but they hadn't reversed it. This is where Chrysler made the decision that separates this story from every other manufacturer racing story of that era. Instead of taking another modest step forward, instead of refining the Charger 500 concept incrementally and hoping to catch Ford, they basically said forget convention. Let's build something that makes the Talladega look timid. The result was the Dodge Daytona. And when I tell you this car looked different, I need you to genuinely picture what different meant in this context. This wasn't a subtle redesign. This wasn't a slightly longer nose or a revised spoiler angle. This was a car that looked like it had been designed by engineers who had never actually seen a standard automobile before, who had only been given a description of one and a list of aerodynamic requirements. The front end of the Daytona featured a pointed nose cone, a full fiberglass structure that extended 18 inches beyond the standard Charger's front bumper. Not a few inches. 18 inches. The thing literally looked like a missile had been bolted to the front of a Dodge. That nose cone was designed using everything Pointer's team had learned in the wind tunnel. It created a smooth, uninterrupted path for air to flow around the front of the car, eliminating the turbulent zones that had been costing them speed. But the nose cone, as dramatic as it was, wasn't even the most radical element of the Daytona. That honor belonged to the wing. That wing stood nearly 2 feet tall. Not 2 inches. 2 feet. It was mounted on a pair of vertical struts that rose directly from the rear fenders, putting the whole structure high up in the airflow above the car's roofline. From certain angles, especially dead-on from the rear, the Daytona looked less like a race car and more like something that had escaped from a wind tunnel display. It was simultaneously the most ridiculous and the most purposeful thing anyone had ever bolted onto a stock car. Now, you might be thinking, why does a race car need a wing that tall? Why not just add a small spoiler like everyone else? And that's exactly the right question, because the answer reveals how far ahead of everyone else Chrysler's engineers actually were. At high speed, specifically on the superspeedways where NASCAR ran its most prestigious events, the rear end of a car experiences significant aerodynamic lift. The air flowing over the roof and trunk of the car follows a path that creates low pressure above the rear deck and higher pressure beneath the car's body. That pressure difference generates an upward force. It literally tries to pull the rear tires off the track. The faster you go, the stronger that lifting force becomes. This isn't theoretical. There are documented cases from that era of cars actually becoming airborne at speed, which is every bit as dangerous and violent as it sounds. Chrysler's engineers understood this and designed the Daytona's wing to counteract it directly. The wing was shaped like an airfoil, but inverted. Instead of generating lift the way an airplane wing does, it generated downforce, pushing the rear of the car toward the track surface. More downforce meant more grip. More grip meant the car could corner faster and stay more stable at top speed. Here's what most people don't realize about why that wing was mounted so high. Chrysler's wind tunnel testing showed that the air directly behind the car's body was turbulent and unpredictable. All that turbulence meant inconsistent downforce, which is actually worse than less downforce because it makes the car handle unpredictably. By mounting the wing high, the engineers got it up into clean, smooth airflow above all that turbulence. Clean air meant the wing worked consistently and predictably every single lap. There was also a practical reason for the height, one that sounds almost comical given the engineering seriousness of everything else involved. With the wing mounted that high on its struts, you could still open the trunk lid. NASCAR's rules required that the cars be genuine production vehicles that regular customers could actually use. That meant the trunk had to function. So the Daytona's spectacular 2-foot wing was, in part, positioned where it was because somebody had to be able to reach in and grab their groceries. I love that detail. It perfectly captures the strange collision between motorsport engineering and the reality of street car production rules that defined this entire era. Chrysler built 503 Daytonas for the street to meet NASCAR's minimum production requirement, and those street cars came with the full treatment. The 18-inch nose cone, the massive rear wing, everything. Which meant that in 1969, a regular American with enough money could walk into a Dodge dealership and drive home in a car that looked like it had been designed for a different planet entirely. On September 14, 1969, the Dodge Daytona made history that the racing world is still talking about. At Talladega Superspeedway in Alabama, the very track that Ford had named their aerodynamics special after, driver Buddy Baker climbed into a Daytona and did something no NASCAR driver had ever officially done before. He turned a closed-course lap at over 200 miles per hour. 200.447 miles per hour to be exact. Think about what that number meant in 1969. The moon landing had happened just 2 months earlier. The world's fastest production cars were barely cracking 150 miles per hour. And here was a stock car, a vehicle related to something you could buy at a dealership, circling a track at 200 miles per hour. The competition didn't know what had hit them. But Chrysler wasn't finished, because the Dodge Daytona was only half of their Winged Warrior program. The other half belonged to Plymouth. Now, this is where the story gets a little complicated from an engineering standpoint, because Plymouth's flagship performance car, the Roadrunner, had a completely different body structure than the Dodge Charger. They couldn't just take the Daytona's nose cone and wing and bolt them onto a Roadrunner. The geometry was all wrong, the mounting points didn't exist, and the aerodynamic characteristics of the Roadrunner's body were different enough that a direct translation wouldn't work. So Plymouth's engineers had to start from scratch. They took the core concept, pointed nose, rear wing, flush glass surfaces, and redesigned every element to work with the Roadrunner's body. The car they created was the 1970 Plymouth Superbird. And if the Daytona had looked like something from another planet, the Superbird looked like a cartoon version of a race car. Everything was slightly more exaggerated, slightly more dramatic, and somehow even more visually shocking than the Daytona had been. The Superbird's nose cone was actually more complex than the Daytona's because it had to work around the Roadrunner's headlight placement. Plymouth's engineers solved this with hidden headlights that pivoted open when you switched them on, allowing the nose cone to maintain its clean aerodynamic shape while still meeting street car requirements. The fenders had to be modified and extended. The rear window, like on the Charger 500 before it, was replaced with flush-mounted glass. And the rear wing, because of the Roadrunner's slightly higher trunk line, ended up sitting even taller than the Daytona's. Looking at a Superbird from the rear quarter was genuinely disorienting. The wing just seemed to go up forever. This is where it gets really interesting, because the 1970 NASCAR season that followed became a demonstration of just how completely right Chrysler's engineers had been. The Winged Warriors didn't just compete. They dominated. Pete Hamilton, a relatively unknown driver at the time, won the Daytona 500 in a Superbird. Not a close win, either. A decisive one that made clear the Chrysler cars had an advantage that couldn't be explained away by driver skill or luck. Richard Petty, the king himself, ran a Superbird for the 1970 season and won 8 races. Richard Petty, one of the greatest drivers in the history of the sport, in a winged Chrysler, winning 8 times. Bobby Isaac campaigned at Dodge Daytona for the K&K insurance team and won 11 races, eventually claiming the 1970 NASCAR Grand National Championship. The winged cars were particularly devastating on the superspeedways, the big high-banked ovals where top speed and aerodynamic stability mattered more than mechanical grip and tight corner handling. Tracks like Talladega and Daytona became effectively Chrysler's personal property during this period. Now, you might be thinking the other manufacturers must have simply accepted this and gone back to the drawing board. But that is not what happened. Not even close. Ford was furious. Their Torino Talladega, which had been the aerodynamic leader just a season earlier, was suddenly obsolete. They didn't have an answer ready, and they knew it would take at least a full development cycle to produce something competitive. General Motors, which had never even seriously entered the aerodynamic arms race, was watching Chevrolet and Pontiac cars get lapped by winged Dodges and Plymouths on the fastest tracks. The complaints from both manufacturers landed on NASCAR's desk with considerable force. Here's what most people don't realize about how NASCAR actually worked in this era. The organization wasn't just a neutral sporting body applying rules evenly and fairly. It was a business, and its primary customers were the manufacturers who funded the sport through their racing programs. If Ford decided NASCAR wasn't worth the investment and pulled out, if General Motors followed, the whole enterprise would collapse. So when 2 of the 3 major manufacturers said the winged cars were unfair and were destroying competition, NASCAR had a very strong financial incentive to listen carefully. The first response came for the 1970 season. NASCAR raised the minimum production requirement for aerodynamic specials from 500 units to 1,000. The calculation behind this rule was straightforward. Building specialized race-focused cars is expensive. If you double the minimum production run required to qualify, maybe manufacturers will think twice before going to such extreme length. Chrysler's response was essentially a shrug followed by action. They built more than 1,900 Superbirds for the 1970 model year, well above the new minimum, plus additional Daytonas. The street versions of these cars were simultaneously extraordinary and ridiculous. They came with slightly detuned engines compared to the race versions, standard suspensions, full interior appointments, and all that wild bodywork. A regular person with around $4,500, which was a significant sum in 1970 but not out of reach for a serious enthusiast, could walk into a Plymouth dealership and drive away in a car with a nose cone that extended 1.5 feet past the bumper and a wing that would scrape most garage ceilings. Look, the street sales situation for the Winged Warriors is one of the most genuinely painful chapters in American automotive history, and I don't think it gets talked about enough. Because when you understand what happened to these cars at the dealership level in 1970 and 1971, and then you look at what they're worth today, the contrast is almost physically uncomfortable. When the Superbirds arrived at Plymouth dealerships in late 1969 and early 1970, the salespeople had a problem. The cars were weird. Not weird in a way that was easy to overlook. Profoundly, unavoidably, conversation-stoppingly weird. That 18-inch nose cone made parking in a normal space a genuine challenge. You couldn't judge where the front of the car ended, and misjudging it meant fiberglass repair bills. The rear wing stood tall enough to scrape against a standard residential garage ceiling, which meant a significant percentage of potential buyers simply couldn't store the car at home. The insurance companies had flagged anything with NASCAR heritage as a high-performance vehicle, which sent premiums to levels that made the purchase price look almost reasonable by comparison. And then there was the simple visual reality. In 1970, most American car buyers wanted muscle cars that looked like muscle cars. Aggressive, sure. Powerful, absolutely. But recognizable. The Superbird looked like something from the future, and not necessarily a future that 1970 Americans were comfortable with. Dealerships started reporting that the cars were sitting on lots. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Some dealers offered discounts of over $1,000, which in 1970 represented a genuinely significant reduction off the sticker price. Others went further. This is the part that hurts. Some dealers actually removed the nose cones and rear wings entirely, converting the Superbirds back to something closer to a standard road runner appearance, just to make the cars sellable. Think about that for a second. The engineering achievement that represented the pinnacle of Chrysler's aerodynamic development program was being physically removed from cars because the buying public found it too strange. There are documented cases of Superbirds being retitled and sold as used cars within the first year of their production. Cars that were brand new, that had never been raced, that were engineering masterpieces, being treated as slightly embarrassing inventory problems. The Daytonas had similar struggles, though their production numbers were lower and their racing association slightly more established by the time the Superbird came along. Here's what most people don't realize about how the surviving numbers break down today. Of the roughly 1,920 Superbirds produced, historians and registries estimate that somewhere between 700 and 800 genuine, unmodified, original examples survive in any condition. Many were crashed and scrapped. Many had their aerodynamic components removed and discarded. A significant number were simply driven into the ground and junked when they wore out, because in the early 1970s, there was no reason to think these cars would become valuable. They were just used cars with weird noses and big wings that nobody had wanted when they were new. A pristine, numbers-matching Hemi-powered Superbird, one with the correct engine, the correct options, documented history, and unmodified bodywork, can sell at major auctions for well over $1 million today. Some exceptional examples have pushed considerably beyond that. The cars that dealers were discounting by $1,000, the cars that people were converting back to road runners to make them saleable, those exact cars, in their original winged configuration, are now among the most valuable American automobiles ever produced. It's one of the most dramatic reversals of perception in automotive history. Something that was too radical for its time, too strange, too committed to function over form, became the very thing that makes it extraordinary decades later. Now, I want to pull back from the specific cars for a moment and talk about something bigger, because I think the cultural context of the Winged Warriors is actually as important as the engineering story. The late 1960s and early 1970s represented the absolute peak and the beginning of the rapid decline of American muscle car culture. The philosophy that had driven everything in Detroit through the 60s, more displacement, more horsepower, more speed, was about to collide with a series of external forces that would essentially end the era. Emissions regulations were coming. The federal government had begun requiring catalytic converters and other systems that, with the technology of the time, were incompatible with high-compression, high-horsepower engines. Insurance companies had started classifying high-performance vehicles as unacceptably risky and were pricing policies accordingly. And then the oil crisis of 1973 would make large displacement gas-guzzling engines politically and economically untenable almost overnight. The winged warriors arrived at the absolute peak of the era they represented. They were the logical endpoint, the most extreme possible expression of the philosophy that had dominated American car culture for a decade. Chrysler took the brute force horsepower approach that everyone had been using and combined it with genuine aerospace-level engineering thinking. The result was cars that were faster than anything the sport had seen, and also cars that were too radical for the buying public, too dominant for the sport, and too soon for the world to appreciate properly. When NASCAR finally brought the hammer down for the 1971 season, they did it in a way that was technically clever but obviously targeted. The new rules limited engine displacement for aerodynamic specials to 305 cubic inches. Standard body cars could run up to 430 cubic inches. For reference, the Daytona and Superbird had been running engines of 426 cubic inches in their race configurations. The new rules cut that by nearly 30% while allowing the competition to keep their full displacement. You could have the slipperiest, most aerodynamically perfect car ever built, but if you're giving up 125 cubic inches of engine displacement to the competition on a superspeedway, you are not going to win. The aerodynamic advantage of the wing cars simply couldn't compensate for that kind of power deficit. Chrysler understood the message immediately. There was no point in running the winged cars under those rules. The Daytona and the Superbird disappeared from NASCAR competition. After just 1 and 2 seasons of racing, respectively, the most dominant cars the sport had ever seen were effectively legislated out of existence. The manufacturers didn't fight it. They couldn't. NASCAR held the power to set the rules, and the other manufacturers had made clear they would rather race against standard-looking cars than continue getting beaten by winged ones. The era of the winged warriors was over almost before it had really begun. Or was it? See, here's the thing about innovations that actually work. They don't disappear when the rules change. They go underground and wait. The lessons that John Poynter and his team learned in those defense-contractor wind tunnels in the late 1960s became the foundation of a new discipline in motorsport. The understanding that aerodynamics could be engineered rather than just accepted, that you could actively manage airflow to gain competitive advantage rather than simply minimizing drag through styling, that understanding spread through racing at every level over the following decade. Formula One teams had already been working on aerodynamics independently, and the late 1960s and early 1970s saw an explosion of aerodynamic development in that series as well. Sports car racing, endurance racing, even open-wheel domestic series began investing in wind tunnel development. The idea that Poynter had brought to NASCAR, that airflow is a variable you can control, not just a force you endure, became universal. And it filtered back into NASCAR itself. Today's NASCAR Cup Series cars are developed with extensive computational fluid dynamics modeling and wind tunnel testing. The aerodynamic package, including restrictor plates, spoiler sizes, and underbody regulations, is one of the most fiercely debated and carefully monitored aspects of the rulebook. Every team has aerodynamicists on staff. Every change to the rules produces immediate analysis of the aerodynamic implications. The sport that once thought purely in terms of horsepower now thinks as much about airflow management as anything else. The Daytona and the Superbird didn't just win races. They permanently changed what NASCAR was. They forced the sport to think about engineering in a more complete way, and even the rules written to stop them acknowledge the fundamental importance of what they prove. Now let's talk about the drivers, because the machines were only half the story. You can build the most aerodynamically perfect car in the history of motorsport, but somebody still has to strap into it, trust it at speeds that would make most people physically ill, and drive it to the absolute limit of its capabilities. And the drivers who did that with the Winged Warriors were a remarkable collection of individuals. Richard Petty's relationship with the Superbird is the one that gets the most attention, and for good reason. Petty was already the sport's biggest name heading into 1970. He had won 27 races in 1967 alone, a number so absurd that it still stands as the all-time single-season record. He had won the Daytona 500 in 1964 and 1966. He was the face of NASCAR, the driver every sponsor wanted, the name every fan knew. And in 1969, he had been driving for Ford. His decision to switch to Plymouth and the Superbird for 1970 was not just a racing story. It was a business and political story that played out in the racing press for months. Ford was furious, Plymouth was ecstatic, and the racing public was fascinated by what would happen when the sport's biggest star climbed into the sport's most radical car. What happened was 18 wins. In a full season that included races in both the Superbird and other vehicles, Petty won 18 times, cementing the Superbird's legacy as the car that carried the greatest driver of the era to some of his greatest victories. His number 43 Superbird in Petty blue became one of the most iconic racing images of the decade. When people picture the Winged Warriors today, they often picture that specific car with that specific number, and that association between Petty's legacy and the Superbird's engineering has made both even more significant in the historical record. Bobby Isaac's story is different, and in some ways even more interesting from a purely racing perspective. Isaac was a journeyman driver, deeply talented but never quite a household name in the way Petty was. He drove for the K&K insurance team, which ran Dodge Daytonas, and in 1970, he put together one of the most statistically dominant seasons in the history of the sport. 11 wins, 38 top 10 finishes in 47 starts. The Grand National Championship. Isaac was particularly brilliant on the superspeedways where the Daytona's aerodynamic advantages were most pronounced. He had an intuitive understanding of how the car moved through air, how to position himself in traffic to minimize drag, how to use the wing car's stability to carry more speed through the corners than his competitors thought was possible. His championship season with the Daytona is often cited as the clearest evidence that the winged cars weren't just fast in a straight line. They were genuinely superior racing machines in the hands of a skilled driver. And then there was Buddy Baker, the man who broke 200. Baker was known throughout his career as someone who found speed in places other drivers were afraid to look. He was tall, physically imposing, and drove with an aggression that his cars sometimes had trouble containing. The combination of Baker's fearlessness and the Daytona's aerodynamic stability was what produced that September 1969 run at Talladega. What's easy to overlook when you say the number 200 miles per hour is what it actually felt like to be in the car. In 1969, racing safety technology was nowhere near what it is today. The cars had roll cages, but the safety systems that modern drivers take for granted simply didn't exist. Fireproof suits were relatively new. Hans devices hadn't been invented. The tires of the era were not designed with sustained 200-mile-per-hour operation in mind. Baker was not just going fast. He was going fast in conditions that modern motorsport safety standards would not permit. His trust in the Daytona's engineering, in the stability that the wing provided, in the downforce that kept the rear tires planted when the physics wanted to send them skyward, was absolute. And that trust was justified. The car did exactly what Pointer's team had designed it to do. It was stable, predictable, and enormously fast. Baker later described the Daytona at speed as the first car he'd ever driven that felt like it was actually designed to go that fast, rather than just surviving it. That quote captures something important about what the Winged Warriors represented. Previous NASCAR cars had been powerful enough to reach terrifying speeds, but they hadn't been designed for those speeds in any aerodynamic sense. They were fighting the air all the way, and at a certain point, the air started winning. The Daytona was the first car that genuinely cooperated with the physics of high-speed travel instead of simply muscling through it. Pete Hamilton's Daytona 500 victory in the Superbird deserves special mention too, because Hamilton was a relative unknown at the time. He'd run a limited schedule in 1969 without setting the world on fire, and his selection to drive the Petty Enterprises Superbird entry for the 1970 Daytona 500 was seen as something of a gamble. What followed was a dominant performance that shocked the sport. Hamilton controlled the race, managed his equipment with remarkable maturity for someone with his level of experience, and crossed the line well ahead of the competition. His win is often cited as the clearest possible proof that the Superbird's aerodynamic advantages were real and substantial, not just statistical noise. Even an unproven driver in the car could win the sport's biggest race. That's how significant the engineering advantage was. Now, here's what most people don't realize about the competitive dynamic during this period. The other manufacturers' teams didn't lose because their drivers were worse or because their engines were weaker. On short tracks, tight bullrings where aerodynamics mattered less and mechanical grip and horsepower dominated, the Ford and Chevrolet teams remained very competitive. The Winged Warrior's advantage was specifically and dramatically pronounced on the superspeedways. This is actually an important nuance in the story, because it explains both why NASCAR felt compelled to act and why the rule changes they implemented were so targeted. They weren't trying to ban aerodynamics entirely. They were trying to limit the specific advantage that the wing cars had on the tracks where they were essentially untouchable. The problem was that the superspeedways were NASCAR's showcase event. Daytona and Talladega were the races that got the most television coverage, the biggest attendance, the most national press. Having one manufacturer's cars run away with every superspeedway event wasn't just competitively unfair. It was bad television. And bad television, in a sport that was increasingly dependent on broadcast revenue, was an existential threat. So the combination of manufacturer pressure and broadcast concerns created the political environment that made the 1971 rule changes inevitable. And once Chrysler understood that environment clearly, they didn't fight it. They accepted it and moved on. The Winged Warriors had served their purpose. They had proven what Chrysler's engineers knew. They had won the races that needed winning. And they had permanently established that aerodynamics was a legitimate and essential discipline in stock car racing. That legacy was worth the cost of compliance. But the story doesn't end with the ban. Because what happened to aerodynamics after the Winged Warriors is genuinely fascinating, and it connects directly to the cars you see racing today. When Chrysler pulled the Daytona and Superbird from competition after the 1970 season, the engineers who had built them didn't disappear. John Pointer and his team didn't walk out of the special vehicles group and forget everything they'd learned. The knowledge didn't evaporate just because the rules had changed. Instead, it went into the institutional memory of Chrysler's engineering culture and began influencing everything the company did in performance development for years afterward. The specific techniques, wind tunnel methodology, pressure mapping, understanding the relationship between downforce and drag, those became standard tools that Chrysler's engineers carried with them throughout their careers. When they moved into different programs, when they trained younger engineers, when they consulted on road car development, the lessons of the Daytona and the Superbird were embedded in their thinking. And it wasn't just Chrysler. The racing community is small and information travels. Engineers who had competed against the Winged Warriors and lost understood what had beaten them. Ford's aerodynamics program intensified significantly after 1969. General Motors, which had been almost entirely dismissive of aerodynamics in racing up to that point, quietly began investing in wind tunnel development. The arms race didn't end when NASCAR changed the rules. It simply moved off the superspeedways and into the research facilities. Here's what most people don't realize about the timeline of aerodynamic development in NASCAR. In the years immediately following the Winged Warrior era, the sport underwent a gradual but steady transformation in how teams thought about their cars. The rule that limited wing cars to small engines effectively forced everyone back to standard body shapes, but within those standard shapes, teams began looking for aerodynamic advantages they hadn't previously thought to pursue. Small changes to spoiler angles, modifications to how the front valance directed air, attention to how the rear deck lid shape affected airflow. None of these individual changes were as dramatic as an 18-inch nose cone. But cumulatively, across a decade of development, they represented a fundamental shift in how NASCAR teams approached their cars. By the early 1980s, aerodynamics had become a significant factor in car preparation at the Cup level. By the late 1980s, it was arguably as important as engine development. By the 1990s, NASCAR had essentially become an aerodynamic arms race operating within a regulatory framework that tried to keep the competition close. The wing cars had created that world. They had proven the concept so thoroughly that the concept couldn't be uninvented. This is where it gets really interesting when you look at what NASCAR does today. The current Cup Series cars, the next-gen vehicles that were introduced in 2022, are extensively developed aerodynamic packages. The underbody of the car is carefully regulated because teams discovered that ground effects, the management of airflow beneath the car to generate downforce, was an enormous source of potential advantage. The front splitter, the rear spoiler, the roofline shape, all of these are specified in precise detail because NASCAR has learned through decades of experience that any aerodynamic surface left unregulated becomes the center of an arms race. The organization spends enormous resources ensuring that the aerodynamic playing field is level, which is itself a direct consequence of the Daytona and Superbird proving that it could be unlevel in spectacular fashion. There's another fascinating thread that runs from the Winged Warriors into road car development. During the 1970s and 1980s, as the lessons of motorsport aerodynamics filtered into mainstream automotive engineering, the spoiler went from a styling gimmick to a genuine functional element on performance cars. The rear wing on a sports car today, even on a relatively affordable one, is doing real aerodynamic work. The front air dam that directs airflow under the car rather than into it, the side skirts that manage the airflow along the body, these are all concepts that trace their lineage back to the thinking that produced the Daytona and the Superbird. The connection isn't always direct. It's not as if every automotive engineer has a picture of a Superbird on their wall and consciously thinks about it while designing spoilers. But the discipline of automotive aerodynamics as a serious engineering field was legitimized and accelerated by exactly the kind of dramatic proof of concept racing the Winged Warriors provided. When you can show a number, when you can say this aerodynamic change produced this specific improvement in lap time and stability, as Chrysler could with the Daytona, the argument for taking aerodynamics seriously becomes unanswerable. The cultural legacy of the Winged Warriors has evolved in interesting ways too. In the immediate aftermath of their racing career, these cars were largely forgotten by the general public. Through most of the 1970s, they were just used cars, unusual looking, kind of hard to sell, occasionally showing up at dealerships with their wings removed and their nose cones replaced. The collector car market that we know today, where rare and significant automobiles command enormous sums, barely existed in the early 1970s. People weren't thinking about these cars as investments or artifacts. They were thinking about them as transportation, which meant they got driven and worn out and crashed and scrapped at normal rates. The reassessment began slowly in the late 1970s and accelerated through the 1980s as muscle car collecting became a serious hobby. People who had grown up watching Richard Petty race the Superbird and Bobby Isaac campaign the Daytona were reaching the age and income level where they could pursue the cars they remembered from their youth. And when they went looking for Winged Warriors, they discovered how few remained. The scarcity drove prices upward, which attracted more attention, which drove prices further upward. By the late 1980s, a decent-condition Superbird had become genuinely valuable. By the 1990s, exceptional examples were selling for six figures. Today, as I mentioned, the ceiling for a top-condition Hemi Superbird has cleared $1 million, with some examples achieving considerably more at prestigious auctions. The Daytona market follows similar patterns, though the lower production numbers and slightly different body design create a somewhat different collector dynamic. What's remarkable is that the very qualities that made these cars difficult to sell in 1970, the outrageous aerodynamic bodywork, the impracticality, the visual extremity, are precisely the qualities that make them extraordinary and valuable today. A standard 1970 Roadrunner, even a very nice one, is worth a fraction of what a Superbird commands. The engineering additions that nobody wanted in 1970 are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars today. This reversal of perception is one of the cleanest examples in automotive history of something being too far ahead of its time. The public wasn't ready for aerodynamic engineering on a street car in 1970. They wanted their muscle cars to look a certain way, and a nose cone plus a 2-foot wing was not that way. But time has a way of clarifying what actually matters. And what actually mattered about the Superbird and the Daytona was that they were genuinely extraordinary engineering achievements wearing extraordinary shape. Once the era they came from became history rather than present, once the weirdness became iconic rather than off-putting, the true significance of what Chrysler had built became apparent to everyone. There's a lesson in there that extends well beyond cars. Revolutionary ideas are often rejected not because they're wrong but because they arrive before the cultural context exists to appreciate them. The winged warriors were right about aerodynamics years before the mainstream automotive and motorsport world was ready to accept that verdict. And they paid for being right by being banned from competition and ignored in showrooms. It took decades for the world to catch up to what John Pointer and his team had proven in a defense contractor's wind tunnel in the late 1960s. So here's the question I keep coming back to, the one that makes this story impossible to fully close. What would have happened if NASCAR had never banned the winged warriors? What if, instead of raising production minimums and slashing engine displacement allowances, NASCAR had simply let the aerodynamic arms race run its course? Would Ford have come back with something equally radical? Would General Motors have finally committed to real aerodynamic development? Would the superspeedway speeds have continued climbing past 200, past 210, past 220, until physics or safety finally imposed the limits that the rulebook wouldn't? We'll never know for certain, but the engineering trajectory suggests that the answers would have been yes, yes, and absolutely yes. Ford was already working on concepts when the rule changes came. Their engineers understood what Chrysler had done and had identified several potential responses. General Motors, which had enormous engineering resources, had simply chosen not to commit to aerodynamic development because the organizational consensus was that horsepower would remain dominant. A continued winged warrior era would have forced that recalculation, and the speeds would have continued climbing. Wind tunnel research doesn't stop. Every season of development produces insights that feed the next season's improvement. The understanding of airflow management that Chrysler had developed in 1969 would have continued evolving, producing incrementally faster and more stable cars with every iteration. Whether that would have been good for the sport is a genuinely complicated question. Higher speeds mean higher risk. The safety technology of the early 1970s was not adequate for significantly faster speeds than the winged warriors were already achieving. At some point, the physics would have produced accidents that the era's safety systems couldn't protect drivers from. NASCAR's concern wasn't entirely about competitive balance. There were genuine safety questions embedded in the speed equation. But here's the thing about that argument. The skills and the techniques and the engineering knowledge that were developed during the Winged Warrior program fed directly into safety improvements as well. Understanding how a car moves through air at high speed, understanding lift forces and downforce and turbulence, is essential to designing cars that don't become airborne in accident. The aerodynamic research that made the Daytona and Superbird fast also laid groundwork for understanding how to keep race cars on the ground in emergency situations. Modern superspeedway safety, including the roof flaps that deploy to prevent cars from becoming airborne when they spin, is built on exactly the kind of aerodynamic understanding that the Winged Warrior program advanced. So even the safety case against allowing the aerodynamic arms race to continue is complicated by the reality that the arms race itself was generating safety-relevant knowledge. The ban was still probably the right call for the sport at that specific moment in history. NASCAR in 1970 was a different business than it is today. The financial structures, the television relationships, the sponsor ecosystem, all of it was more fragile. Losing Ford or General Motors as competitors would have been genuinely devastating in ways that might not have been recoverable. The competitive balance argument, however cynical its origins in manufacturer lobbying, reflected a real need for the sport to remain viable. But knowing the ban was necessary doesn't make it any less fascinating to consider the alternative timeline. I want to talk about John Poynter one more time, because his story represents something important about what engineers do when their most significant work gets regulated out of existence. Poynter continued at Chrysler for years after the Winged Warrior program ended. He didn't become famous in the way that the cars he helped create became famous. He wasn't Richard Petty. Nobody made television documentaries about him at the time. He was an engineer, which meant his legacy lived in the work rather than in public recognition. But within the automotive engineering community, within the specialized world of motorsport development, the Daytona and Superbird program was understood as a landmark achievement. It represented the first systematic application of aerospace-level aerodynamic thinking to American stock car racing. And Poynter had led it. The methodology he developed, using wind tunnels to test scale models, mapping pressure distributions across the car's surface, understanding the relationship between specific body features and their aerodynamic effects, became foundational practice. Young engineers who studied the program went on to careers in racing and road car development, carrying those principles with them. The knowledge replicated itself in the way that genuinely good ideas always do. It found new hosts and new applications and new forms, long after the original context had been regulated away. That's the deepest truth about the Winged Warriors. Their physical legacy is the surviving cars, the ones that escaped conversion and neglect and still exist in their original winged form. Their historical legacy is the 1970 NASCAR season, that extraordinary campaign of dominance that proved beyond any argument what the right aerodynamic thinking could produce. But their engineering legacy is something broader and harder to see. It's in every race car that uses a wind tunnel. It's in every CFD simulation that a modern racing team runs before a major event. It's in the way NASCAR's rulebook today devotes enormous attention to aerodynamic regulation. It's in the underbody development of modern sports cars and the front splitter on a production performance vehicle. The Winged Warriors changed how the automotive world thinks about air. That's a legacy that no rulebook change can touch. And look, I think there's something genuinely moving about that. About a group of engineers who did something extraordinary, who built cars that were too right for the world they existed in, who watched those cars get banned after barely 2 seasons, and whose most important contribution couldn't be banned because it lived in knowledge rather than hardware. The Dodge Daytona and the Plymouth Superbird were extraordinary machines. But what made them truly significant was what building them taught the people who built them and the people who competed against them and the people who came after. Racing history is full of cars that were fast. The Winged Warriors were cars that were transformative. That's the difference. And that's why, more than 50 years later, when you see a Superbird at a car show or a Daytona at an auction, when that enormous wing comes into view above the crowd and people stop and stare and pull out their phones, what you're really looking at is the physical evidence of a moment when a small group of engineers refused to accept the limitations of conventional thinking and changed the sport forever. The world wasn't ready for them in 1969. It's ready now. And honestly, knowing the story, knowing what it cost to build them and race them and then lose them to regulatory politics, maybe that's exactly right. Some things are worth waiting for. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and leave a comment below. Had you heard of the Dodge Daytona and Plymouth Superbird before today? Drop it down there. I read every single one. This is Legacy Motoring. I'll see you in the next one.